Hey guys, this is Chris Snellgrove. I'm the performer for Collin Earl's The House of Grey, and this is episode number 5. What's with the crazy love letters, not to mention the uber creepy dream? If it's been a while since you tuned in, here's the story up to this point by our very own Casey K. Seriously, this podcast rocks. So far, Arthur and I have become fast friends with Monson. You should see this dude's pad. Totally wicked. Anywho, despite Monson's rough start at school, not to mention his totally mysterious past, or, I guess, lack thereof, everything should be pretty chill for the most part, as it's the first day of actual classes today. But you never can tell what's gonna go down at Collin, especially with Monson around. I'll check all y'all later. I gotta go find that oaf Arthur. I'm totally jonesing for a bonsai burger. Where is that dude? Yo, Arthur. An odd sound filled the space of Monson's room as his digital clock hit 6 a.m. He reached over and hit the snooze button, cringing at the thought that it was already morning. You gotta be kidding me, he thought as he looked bleary-eyed at the alarm clock. He, Artorius, and Casey stayed up late the night before, talking into the early hours of the morning. It was well past 1 when Brian came in and ushered them out. Monson wished they could continue their conversation. Chances like that did not come often, especially to him, so it was hard for him to give it up. He voiced his concern, letting Brian know how he felt. Brian replied that there would be plenty of opportunity for conversation and male bonding later. He pointed out the two boys were not going anywhere, and that sleepovers were even allowed in the dorms, but not tonight. With an argument like that, it was almost impossible to refute him, though both Casey and Monson tried anyway. He stretched as he slid slowly to the floor, surprised at how cool it was. Oh, how he hated cool weather. It always made him feel older than he was. The skin on his body seemed extra sensitive to changes in the weather, and the cold made him feel achy and sore. He disrobed, showered, dressed, and within a half an hour was walking towards his minibar, hoping to find something to eat. Good morning, my dear hero. Ah! Monson jumped, almost stumbling in surprise. Oh, Brian, you scared the hell out of me. He turned to see Brian on the far side of the room, opening the shades of the double-wide windows. He caught a look of the forest peppered with a light mist before Brian grabbed his attention. Such language! And how do we fare this morning, Master Grey? Sorry about that, Brian. No complaints here. He turned back towards his minibar. Hey, Brian. Yes, hero. Where can I find something to eat? I'm starving. He turned back toward Brian, just in time to see him give a faint smile. He replied with an air of great patience. It depends on how you would like to take your breakfast. What do you mean by how I would like to take my breakfast? Monson raised his eyebrow. How do most people around here take their breakfast? Brian laughed. For some reason, Brian seemed to find Monson very funny. It kind of annoyed Monson. What I mean, hero, is that you have a choice, unlike most of the students. If you prefer, you can take your breakfast in the halls with your classmates, or I can have it prepared and brought up here where you can breakfast in peace. Monson thought for a minute. He decided he would rather eat in the halls, wherever that was. This whole Horm beer business was already getting old. If yesterday was any indication, it was just going to get worse. He might as well get it over with. It would be like pulling off a Band-Aid quickly. At least, that's what he hoped. He started to answer Brian's inquiry, but a knock on the door saved him the trouble. I'll get it, Monson said quickly before Brian could respond. He moved briskly out from behind the minibar towards the great oak door, ignoring Brian's objections. Monson gave him a look over his shoulder. Brian just smiled and shook his head. What's up? Casey strolled into the apartment even before Monson finished opening the door. Artorius came in behind him.
Dude, aren't you ready yet? We got places to go, hero. Time waits for no man. Move it already.
And morning to you, Casey.
Morning, hero.
Artorius shot Monson a quick smile.
I hope we find you well.
Why are you calling me that? He had noticed that Brian had a habit of using that title, but then again, Brian was a little weird, and a servant to boot. Maybe it was a rule or something. He was not sure, so he let it slide. He understood why Casey called him that. He was just a smartass. However, this was the first time he remembered Artorius using the title. He hoped that all of them would lose interest before it became a habit, before it stuck. He certainly did not want to be hero for all 4 years of high school.
Because it suits you.
Artorius gave him a sly grin.
And, if you can survive this year, you'll really have earned it.
What do you mean by that?
Well, boys, it would be prudent for all of you to be off. You do not want to be late for your first lessons. Do any of you know the way to the GM?
They all glanced at one another and shook their heads vigorously.
Well then, let me find a school map and I will show you.
A few minutes later, Artorius, Casey, and Monson were gaining ground as they navigated Monson's apartment, his personal elevator, and the indoor atrium. There was an exit through the main section of the student dorms, but Casey put the kibosh on that plan, explaining that by the time they wound their way through the hordes of students, it would be time for their first class. Outside the atrium, the boys found themselves in a sea of people moving lazily along the main pathway leading from the barracks. Noticeable smaller groups started to form as friends found one another, stopping as they did and periodically blocking the path, which in turn forced others to go around them. The trio moved into the larger group and found their attention divided as the conversation meandered from subject to subject. They did not worry about their destination, but left the navigation of their path to the tide of students, assuming that eventually they would arrive at the GM. As Casey went into a full-out rant about football and something called the Power Eye, Monson was left to observe his fellow students. This was his first time around the full student body, and he found it unpleasant. Exhaustion caused him to stay indoors the previous evening while the other students met their room and floormates, and shortly thereafter their classmates of the opposite sex. He could already see cliques forming among the different students. For some reason, this bothered him. Maybe it was because he had never been a part of a group or crowd, and was jealous of it. He saw similar behavior from the kids that lived in a town out a ways from his childhood home. When he was younger, they all played together, regardless of what anyone else said, but they grew apart as they got older, until the time when no one came around. Their names were in his journal, but he could not remember their faces now, not for the life of him. Viewing this behavior in his post-accident state, it seemed natural for high school students. TV taught him that. Despite this, he did not understand it. There had to be a reason for teenagers' tendency to congregate and exclude, but he had yet to figure that one out. He looked back over his shoulder at the place that would be his home for at least the next year. He felt the unpleasantness rise up again. The living arrangement would serve to complicate an already complex situation. From a map of campus in his apartment, he was able to ascertain the layout of many of the bigger buildings on campus and the location of the various offices and departments. There was a lot more to this campus than one might suppose. He also found an information packet. He had flipped through it until he found the barracks, which was exactly what he had been looking for. The barracks had 2 wings, one for each respective sex, and 8 floors shared among grades 9 through 12. These were excluding the elite quarters for private tutors and their pupils, which was on another part of the campus. The map showed another smaller dorm building about a half-mile west, right on the border of the national forest. He could see this building from his bedroom window, and guessed that it was probably not used anymore, as the entire regular student body, as massive as it was, could fit in the dormitory. He originally thought, upon seeing the structure, that it was the elite dorms, not knowing what else it could be. He corrected his misconception when he looked for the elite dorms on the map and found them on a separate part of campus. The old building felt out of place for him, like a scar on a pretty face, but he was not one to let stuff like that bother him too much. In the barracks, the male and female students lived a precarious coexistence, separated by elaborate means. The dorms had cameras, door locks, and a variety of other safety precautions in place. There were certain times when the dividers came down and the students could explore each other's living space, but only with close supervision. All students also shared a ridiculously large common room that was adjacent to the indoor atrium and continued underneath it. Nicknamed the Jive, the room hosted pool tables, ping pong, vending machines, a couple of large plasma TVs, and other means of entertainment, all available to those who spent their leisure time there. The washing machines and dryers were there as well, though most of the students opted for the X service, or executive service, which provided a staff to handle things like laundry and cleaning. Really, if it was not for the school uniforms and the age of the occupants, a person might think the dorm was a high-class resident hall for some uppity university.
Hi there.
Monson almost jumped out of his skin as a sweet voice brought him sharply back to reality. Wrapped up in his own thoughts, he was just now noticing that not only were Artorius and Casey nowhere to be seen, but he now stood in the midst of a group of smoking hot upperclassmen girls, with no recollection on how it happened. A particularly cute girl with curly, strawberry blonde hair stood in front of him, smiling, but looking slightly confused at his sudden appearance. He studied her for a moment, not sure what to say. He tried to smile, but all he could manage was a quasi-frown. He heard whispers behind him, but did not turn around, focusing all the more closely on the curly-haired girl. As he looked at her, embarrassment notwithstanding, he could not help but notice that she had a very defined appearance, abrupt and distinguished, that nevertheless framed her face with an artistic grace. Far from tainting, her looks gave her an almost foreign countenance that exuded an exotic appeal. Her curly hair was obscuring part of her face, giving her a mysterious presence. It was both intriguing and, dare he say it, sexy. He did not even notice that he was completely staring at her. Though he finally spoke, he did not take his eyes off her.
"Oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt."
The girl did not answer right away, but studied him curiously, a strange look on her face.
"Don't I know you from somewhere?" "No, I don't think so."
He was taking steadying breaths as the stares of the girl's companions started to creep under his skin.
And if you're trying to pick me up, you should just start by asking me my name."
The words had left his mouth before he could get his tongue wrapped around them. He clapped his hand over his big fat trap and groaned in horror. Realizing how dumb he probably looked, he tried to play it off. What in the world was he thinking? He cringed and waited for the blast of mockery that was imminent.
"Well, it appears our new hero has a sense of humor."
The curly redhead beamed around at all her friends. Her diverted glance did not linger, however, and quickly returned to Monson. Her expression was light, pleasant even. He was not quite sure what to do at this point. She was looking directly in his eyes. This would not seem like a big deal to most people, but to someone who looked like he did, it was completely unnerving. One of the problems with the physically disfigured, Monson had learned, was that very few people ever looked you in the eye. Perhaps it came from being scared or embarrassed, or maybe it was just that car accident on the side of the road phenomena, where you really want to look, though you know you probably shouldn't. So people overcompensated by looking anywhere else. This was just something that he eventually became used to. There was not a lot he could do about it. It bothered him, but not because his feelings were hurt or anything like that. He knew his experiences were molding him, changing him, making him view people as if they were all the same. He expected the reverse was true, that he was the same in everyone else's eyes, that they viewed his scarred appearance as a reflection of him. Actually, though Monson did not like to admit it, he could plainly see why people fell into that trap. He felt a twinge of self-pity well up. He had lost so much of himself, his family, friends, even his memories. He did not want to lose any more. Maybe that is why people avoiding his gaze bugged him so much. It was true, the old Monson left very little, but he did leave his mannerisms. They were still there. Maybe he felt compelled to lose that important piece of himself too, just to fit in. Those mannerisms were one of the few pieces that remained. Monson gazed at the curly-haired redhead. This girl, she was different. She did not look startled, let alone scared. The girl stood her ground, watching him with interest and with a hint of something that felt like a chance or an opportunity. How was he supposed to react to that? I'm Monson. Monson put out his hand, trying his best to forget his embarrassment. He attempted light conversation. How do you know that I'm the new Hornveer? Alas, that's a long story. It took me a second to recognize you. I'm sorry about that. Without warning, she curtsied. Monson stood, baffled. Deciding he should do something so he did not appear rude, he gave an awkward bow in return. The girls in the circle laughed again. So, you still haven't answered my question. Monson peered at her with an analytical eye. You're right. Her smile grew more pronounced by the second. He raised an eyebrow but did not say anything. Laughing slightly at his reaction. Let's just say I was there when you took the title from the reigning champ. You put on quite the show. She gave him a little wink. That small gesture brought an interesting reaction from the group of girls that surrounded Monson and the redhead. Gasps and muttering broke out and was so loud that Monson felt like he had to almost yell to be heard. I didn't catch your name. Taurus. In contrast, her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. Despite this, he could hear every syllable, every inflection. He could hear her perfectly. Taurus Green.
Hey, Monson!
A voice bellowed from a ways off. Monson turned from Taurus to see Casey and Artorius staring at him, looks of awe comically contorting their faces. Monson laughed and turned back towards the girl. I'd better go. He pushed his hair out of his face and gestured towards the two boys. Yeah, you're right. Maybe I'll see you around. Maybe. He smiled at her again. But only if you're lucky. Without another word, he turned around and walked smoothly towards the still gawking Casey and Artorius, while thoughts bounced around in his head like crackling popcorn. If you're lucky? What a stupid comment. Who talks like that? He thought to himself. Monson neared Artorius and Casey.
Has the world gone mad?
Artorius placed his hand over his eyes and squinted into the distance.
How is it that we find you in the company of Taurus Green?
Why, is that bad? Monson started to come out of his internal monologue. No, dude, it's amazing. Casey looked just as bewildered as Artorius. She's like one of the hottest girls. He struggled to find the word. Ever, dude. And she's like totally famous. She seems really nice. Do you guys know her? We've met, but we've never had what I'd call an extensive conversation. I had a backstage pass to Summer Jam last year. Whoa. His eyes faded as if he were losing the ability to focus them. Bruh, the gorge was wicked. She performed there. I met her then. I wouldn't call our conversation extensive either. We just introduced ourselves. It wasn't a big deal. Though, I must say, it was kind of weird that she knew who I was. Dude, she knew who you were? That is weird. What did she say, man? Nothing really. Monson shrugged.
but she called me hero. Though I guess she could have known that fact any number of ways. Maybe she was at orientation yesterday. She did say something about being there when I won my scholarship, but she would probably remember that better than I do. I should ask her about it sometime.
Grey, that doesn't make any sense.
Artorius' voice sounded somewhat hollow, like he was not all there.
Why would a junior be at a freshman orientation?
Monson mentally corrected himself. So, she was a junior. That would make her 16, maybe 17?
Dude, the plot thickens.
Casey rubbed his face like he had a beard. He looked thoughtful for a moment, but quickly switched to confusion.
Hey, hold up, bro. What do you mean she would know better than you would? I mean, you were there, right, when you won your scholarship?
Monson's face flushed. His tongue had slipped. Again. He cursed himself for not thinking and Casey for being so sharp. Luckily, Artorius, who was not paying any attention, saved him.
I can't believe you were talking to Taurus Green. I know people who have been here for 2 years and have only ever seen her.
Monson jumped on the chance to change the subject back.
Yeah, I think she was kind of flirting with me.
He did not really think she was, but if he was right, then this should take the focus off his prior slip. Both Artorius and Casey gasped. They stared at him in total and utter astonishment.
Mission accomplished,
Monson thought. He liked Artorius and Casey very much, and he planned to tell them eventually, but he was not ready yet. The two boys continued to stare at him until they heard an odd rumble.
Come on.
Artorius looked embarrassed. They all heard the rumble again.
We can ponder the enigmas of Monson's popularity later. I'm starving.
He started to move away, but stopped suddenly, a pained look on his face.
I just can't believe you were talking to Taurus freaking Green. Unbelievable.
Monson and Casey laughed, and with Artorius started walking away from the group of chattering girls. Monson glanced over his shoulder as their pace started to pick up. To his surprise, he was not the only one.
Terrace?
He said to himself.
Interesting.
Then, twisting back towards his friends, he pushed the encounter from his mind.
Wow, that really stands out, doesn't it?
Awe was evident in every line of Monson's shocked face.
Seriously, when they do something, they really do it right, don't they?
You two are easily impressed.
Shut up, Arthur. You're just as impressed as we are.
The boys were standing on the edge of a column-lined walkway that led to another stone arch, similar to the ones outside their dormitory in the modern Colosseum. This particular arch, however, was much larger than any previously seen. The archway marked the entrance to a massive garden and an even larger building behind it that stood out like a mountain. Monson suddenly felt somewhat stupid. How could he have missed this building and the garden? They walked right by it the day before. The events of that previous day must have affected him more than he originally thought. A flare of excitement sparked within him as his eyes feasted upon the true artistry planted before him. The gardens, they were amazing. Flowers of every kind sat divided into neat rows, acting like guards along the stone pathway. Their scents mixed, giving off intoxicating aromas that no human could ever hope to mimic. The stone paths and flowers surrounded grassy knolls where willow, oak, cherrywood, and even pine trees grew, providing both conversation and congregation points. As if this was not enough, Monson thought he also saw the beginnings of a hedge maze on the east side of the building.
The halls?
Artorius sounded as if he was guiding a group of over-eager tourists.
It's almost never called that, though.
Even Casey looked surprised at this revelation. He inquired,
Dude, what do you mean by that, Arthur?
Don't call me Arthur.
Casey rolled his eyes but did not comment. Artorius glared at him and continued with his narration.
Anyway, most of the students call it the GM, or the dungeon.
The GM and the dungeon, huh? Monson chuckled.
What is it with all the nicknames in this place? People at this school have way too much time on their hands. Okay, now I have to ask, why do they call it that? Casey laughed, and even Artorius smiled.
The GM. It stands for the Green Mile. Apparently all the disciplinary offices are on the upper floors. You know, detentions, that sort of thing. The expulsion ratio here has created the Green Mile and the executioners. If you get sent to the office at the very end of the hall, you don't have much chance coming out there still a student.
He stopped for a moment, his gaze finding its way to the upper region of the massive building.
You're right, Grey.
He turned to look at Monson.
People do have too much time on their hands. Anyway, the dungeon nickname has to do with a prank kids pulled on a freshman a few years ago. Though, I also remember reading something about an old settlement here, and some sort of makeshift prison that was built right on the spot or something like that.
Craziness. Monson paused, struck by a sudden thought. Hey, Artorius, what do you mean by makeshift? His question, however, fell upon deaf ears. At that exact moment, a large group of girls walked by giggling and eyeing the trio. Many of them were looking Monson up and down. He thought he heard Taurus's name whispered as they passed. Dude, for someone with no game and the face of a leper, you're awfully popular with the chicas. It sounded as if Casey was trying to say something both witty and profound. Monson went red at the words. Shut up, Casey.
How do they do that little hip shake thing?
Artorius's gaze followed the group of chattering females. His head swayed back and forth with the rhythmic motion of one of the passing girls. A sober look on his face made him look very comical. Monson laughed. The expression on his face was priceless. Monson prodded him to finish. Artorius, man, focus. You were in the middle of a story.
I was?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I just asked you, good morning, boys. All three boys whipped around to see Mr. Gat, dressed in a crisp business suit, standing in a semi-posed position as if he wanted their approval. Looking sharp, Mr. G. Casey looked critically at Mr. Gat. Dude, you got a date or something? Mr. Gat did not answer, but spoke to Monson and Artorius. Are his attempts at wit always this piteous? He must have been trying to be funny because he gave a slight chuckle. He was looking at Monson and Artorius, apparently waiting for them to laugh. The joke, however, was lost on them. Monson gave Mr. Gat a slight smile. Good morning, and how are you this fine day? Good morning to you, hero. I am doing just splendid. I trust you found your quarters suitable? Monson let out a laugh, a real one this time. Yeah, I guess they're adequate. Good, good. And what about you two? Cassius, Arthur, how is Corn treating you this fine morning? Casey replied, Can't complain. Artorius just shrugged. Monson thought he heard a, Don't call me Arthur, come from under his breath. Mr. Gat gave his head a little shake, acknowledging their answers, then gesturing to them. Come, boys, walk with me. Monson, Artorius, and Casey gave each other the merest half-glances, then fell into step with Mr. Gat, who was already bounding towards the halls with surprising briskness. Hey, Mr. Gat. Monson strove to match the taller man's pace. I was wondering, what do you teach here? I mean, what's your subject? Mr. Gat gave him a quick glance and an indiscernible expression, but responded very casually. Why do you ask, hero? Monson shrugged. There was something odd about Mr. Gat. It was obvious that Corn left a bad taste in his mouth. He gleaned this from their conversation the day before. If that was the case and he disliked the school so much, why stay? Not only that, Mr. Gat seemed sharp. What interested someone like him? I don't know. Monson hoped he sounded offhand. I was just thinking about our talk yesterday, and I guess I was curious. Fair enough. Mr. Gat looked coolly unconcerned. Well, if you must know, I teach an experimental history course. He smiled. With the occasional PE courses mixed in for fun. You might say that I'm a dabbler in that field. Casey interjected, looking perplexed. Experimental history? What the hell does that mean? What can be experimental about a history course? Do not swear, Cassius. It is the sign of a weak mind and an undisciplined tongue. Casey looked taken aback. Dude, sorry. Mr. Gatt looked satisfied. In answer to your question, my history classes are both inquisitive and analytical in nature, not mere fact-finding. My students take legends, folk tales, myths, and other mysteries, and look at the different factors that may have gone into both their formulation and perpetuation throughout time. For example, King Arthur. Who was he, and how did he acquire his reputation? Artorius nudged Casey and gave him a sharp look as if to say, "See, I told you so." Casey ignored Artorius and continued to look confused. I don't get it, man. Why take the time? I mean, really, who cares? Cassius, I believe you are missing the point. It is not necessarily important to know just the facts or the details of his life, his favorite foods, or things of that nature. What is important is examining the traditional points of view concerning him and the sources of their origins. This helps us build skills in both analytical and critical thinking. Once acquired, these skills allow us to observe with limited bias, thus helping us form conclusions based on observable fact instead of relying on preconceived notions, which, I hope I do not have to tell you, is one of the greatest skills one can possess. Dude, if you say so. Sounds interesting. To be honest, Monson was not even sure what Mr. Gatt was talking about. Nevertheless, something about the subject caught his interest. He wanted to find out more. So, are freshmen allowed to take this class, or is it upper division only? Mr. Gatt looked surprised but pleased, while both Casey and Artorius gave Monson a sharp look of skepticism. Well, I suppose you will find out soon enough. Monson could tell that Mr. Gatt was trying very hard to hide his amusement. Freshman students have a 6-period day, with 4 of your subjects already chosen for you. English, math, social science, and physical science. You may pick 2 subjects on your own. I do not usually let freshman students into my history classes, but if the 3 of you are particularly interested, I am willing to make an exception. I'm in, Monson almost shouted without even thinking about it. He liked Mr. Gatt, and it would be good to have at least one teacher that he already knew. Wonderful. Mr. Gatt grinned. I must confess, I thought even before I met you that I would probably be seeing you in my class. Monson was not sure exactly what to say to this. He settled for an overtly perplexed look and waited for Mr. Gatt to respond. The Horum Vir is an academic competition that focuses primarily on history. Only someone who studied very diligently could have won that competition. In turn, only someone that enjoys history could read so much about it. So, naturally, I thought I might see our new hero in my class. Something about that explanation did not sit well with Monson, but he decided to ignore it. He was momentarily distracted by Artorius darting in front of him and getting the door to the halls for the rest of their group. Casey was particularly exuberant now that the conversation was shifting away from schoolwork. The boys were just moving to a second set of double doors when it happened. At the second set of doors, Mr. Gatt stepped forward to open them. He grabbed the handle, still chatting animatedly to both Artorius and Casey, and held the door intending to let the 3 boys pass in front of him. The boys obliged, Casey in the lead, Artorius second, and Monson bringing up the rear. Ouch! Artorius's voice shouted as he bumped into Casey. A stream of swear words came spilling out as he doubled over. He spoke through gritted teeth, sounding angry. Case, what's the deal? No answer came. Monson bent sideways so he could see around Artorius. Hey, Casey, what's the whole... He never finished the sentence. One look was all Monson needed to know why Casey had stopped. Casey stood eye to eye with a beautiful upperclassman girl Monson instantly recognized. Sheets of blonde hair pulled into a half ponytail partially hid green eyes that sparkled brilliantly under slightly shaded sunglasses. Kylie Cormack stood in front of Cassius K as a deer stands staring into oncoming traffic. The emotions that raced across her perfect face ranged from regret and pain to indignation and outright disdain. Casey's eyes narrowed and his jaw clenched as he took a step back, gesturing to Kylie to move first. He looked away, avoiding eye contact with her. She walked slowly, not taking her eyes off his face. Her gaze seemed to soften the longer she looked at him. Casey simply stood, unmoving, face averted as if he suddenly had turned to stone. Kylie's friends looked inquisitive, watching curiously as the silent exchange proceeded. Kylie ignored them, maintaining her pace, eyes glued to Casey. What was she doing? Was she trying to catch his eye? Why was he ignoring her? The moment seemed to last a lifetime as Kylie moved in almost slow motion. Monson felt like saying something, but with no knowledge of their past decided against it. He would probably just aggravate an already tense situation. Finally, as if awakening from a trance, Kylie took notice of her surroundings. She seemed to realize that about a dozen people were watching their drama closely. It became very apparent that this did not please her. This discovery brought about a sudden change in her demeanor. The condescending spitfire that Monson experienced in full force the day before flared back to life. Her eyes, which moments ago were soft and tender, were now steely and cold. Monson could only assume that she meant to sweep past Casey, the look of maddening superiority reaffixed to her face. However, her scheme did not happen quite the way she planned. With her attention on Casey and not on her footing, Kylie stumbled, causing the heel of her shoe to crack. There was an audible gasp as the onlookers realized that the only one near enough to help her was Casey, and his eyes were still determinedly not looking at her. In that moment, as time seemed to slow to a crawl, Monson could see the expression on Casey's face. He registered the flicker of indecision barreling through him. Then, quick as a cat, Casey stepped forward, swung his arm down, and caught Kylie around the waist, inches from the floor. Kylie Cormack was not a heavy girl by any means. Still, it was quite a feat to see little Casey, not much bigger than Kylie herself, scoop the girl up in a flash just before she hit the ground. In one fluid motion, he raised her to her feet. Monson gawked at him. There was no way that was normal. Casey handled the girl like a rag doll, moving her with total ease. The strength and speed exhibited by Casey was truly unexpected, amazing, unnatural. Can people really move that fast? Monson wondered to himself. What really caught Monson's attention, even more than Casey's unexpected speed and strength, was his gentle handling of the now thoroughly embarrassed girl. Adoration and tenderness were probably the best terms to use, though this did not quite cover it. Regardless, his actions proved to contradict the scornful undertone used when he spoke of her at orientation. There obviously was a story here, one more complicated than Monson understood. "You might want to be more careful." His voice was quiet, almost comforting. He watched as Kylie righted herself, checking her appearance in the reflection of the glass windows. "I may not be here next time." "I didn't ask for your help." "No, I don't suppose you did." Palpable silence filled the small enclosure as Casey and Kylie stood watching one another. Audible signs of relief reverberated as Casey silently turned and walked towards the still open door, parting utterly perplexed girls in his way. Kylie just watched, her eyes slightly glazed, as if she was looking right through him.
You've been listening to the podcast-only novel of The House of Grey by Collin Earl. For more news, information, and updates, please visit houseofgreybook.com. Music by Figure of Fiends. Visit the band at myspace.com/Figure of Fiends. Cover art for the House of Grey provided by James Thane. More information at THAYN.net.